"You picked the wrong barn, boys," the black woman says as four rough settlers kick down her wooden doors, laughing at what they think will be easy prey. The frontier town sees her as nothing, a lone woman whose mysterious husband probably abandoned her or died in some distant gulch. They whisper she'll lose everything by winter, that her small horse ranch will crumble like all the others. But somewhere in the vast Wyoming territory rides a figure known only in whispered legends, a man whose very name makes hardened criminals flee. What these settlers don't know is that the maps and equipment hidden in her barn hold secrets worth more than gold, and that breaking into her sanctuary has just awakened forces that will reshape their entire world. Will the woman's desperate signal reach him in time, or will the town's corruption finally claim its most dangerous victim? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The morning sun cast long shadows across Redemption Creek as Lavinia Morrow brushed down her favorite mare. The Wyoming territory stretched endlessly beyond her modest ranch, but her world had shrunk to this small patch of land she called home. At 34, she carried herself with quiet dignity that the townspeople mistook for arrogance. Sheriff Marcus Clay had made it clear that certain folks weren't welcome to prosper in his town. The bank president, Edmund Harcourt, spoke in whispers about property taxes and unpaid debts. Even Elias Vickers, the town drunk, averted his eyes when she passed, knowing full well what happened to those who associated with the wrong people. Lavinia heard them coming before she saw them. Four men on horseback approached her barn with the lazy confidence of those who believed themselves untouchable. Cornelius Thorne led the group, his weathered face twisted into a permanent sneer. Behind him rode three younger men, all desperate and hungry for easy money. "Morning, miss," Cornelius called out, dismounting near her fence. "Heard tell you might have some supplies we could borrow." Lavinia set down her brush and faced them. "My barn is private property. Now don't be unfriendly. Times are hard for everyone." Cornelius stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry grass. Surely a Christian woman would help her neighbors. The youngest of the group, barely 18, fidgeted nervously. "Maybe we should just ask politely, Cornelius." "Boy, you let me handle this." Cornelius never took his eyes off Lavinia. "We know you got things worth sharing. Question is whether you're going to be reasonable about it." Lavinia's hand moved casually toward the water bucket beside her. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay emergency supplies she prayed she'd never need. "I've got nothing that belongs to you." "See, that's where you're wrong," Cornelius signaled to his men. "Everything in this territory belongs to those strong enough to take it." The men spread out, surrounding her barn. Their intentions were clear. Lavinia had faced this moment in nightmares, but reality felt strangely calm. She reached into the bucket and pulled out a small brass whistle, carved with intricate patterns. "You picked the wrong barn, boys," she said. Before anyone could react, she blew 3 sharp notes. The sound carried across the valley like a hawk's cry. High above, a magnificent red-tailed hawk circled once, then flew north with purpose. Cornelius laughed. "You calling your chickens for help?" "Something like that." Lavinia stepped back as the men advanced. They forced open her barn doors with crowbars and boots. Inside, they found far more than expected. Expensive surveying equipment sat carefully arranged on wooden tables. Maps covered every wall, detailed drawings of mountain passes and river crossings. Stacks of correspondence in multiple languages filled several crates. "Well, I'll be," whispered one of the men. "Look at all this fancy stuff." Cornelius picked up a brass compass, turning it over in his rough hands. "Where'd a woman like you get equipment like this?" Lavinia remained silent. The young man examined the maps. "These show mineral deposits, Cornelius. Look at all these markings." "Gold?" Cornelius's eyes lit up with greed. "Could be. Or silver. Maybe both." The young man traced routes with his finger. "These maps could make a man rich." Cornelius grabbed Lavinia's arm. "You're coming with us until you explain what all this means. People will notice I'm missing." "What people? That drunk Elias? Sheriff Clay already knows we're here." Cornelius smiled coldly. Turns out the good sheriff has an understanding with certain businessmen in town. They bound her hands with rope and locked her inside her own barn. The irony wasn't lost on Lavinia. She'd spent years mapping escape routes across the territory, yet here she sat trapped in her own home. Outside, she heard them discussing their discovery. The maps fascinated them most. They spoke of forcing her to lead them to gold deposits, of selling information to the highest bidder. If they only knew the truth about those maps. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, heating the barn like an oven. Lavinia worked methodically at her bonds, using techniques learned from sources these men couldn't imagine. The rope finally loosened. Through a gap in the barn wall, she watched Elias Vickers stumble past her property. He paused, noting the strange horses, the men camping on her land. For a moment, their eyes met through the gap. Elias looked away and kept walking. More men arrived as the day wore on. Word had spread about the discovery. What started as simple theft was becoming something larger, more organized. Lavinia recognized some faces from town meetings, men she'd assumed were struggling farmers. They weren't farmers at all. As darkness approached, Cornelius returned to the barn. "Time to talk, woman. These maps of yours have got my partners very interested. I won't help you steal from innocent people." "Steal? We're talking about claiming what's rightfully ours. This territory's got resources, and they should belong to those brave enough to take them." Lavinia studied his face in the lamplight. Behind the greed and cruelty, she saw fear. These weren't random criminals. They were part of something systematic, something that reached into the very heart of Redemption Creek's government. "Who's really behind this, Cornelius?" He smiled. "Let's just say certain influential folks have big plans for this territory. Plans that don't include people like you owning valuable land." Thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming, and with it, changes that would reshape everything these men thought they understood about power in the Wyoming Territory. The question was whether help would arrive before they discovered the true significance of what they'd stumbled upon. The stranger arrived in Redemption Creek just after dawn, leading a tired horse down the main street. He wore simple black clothing and carried a worn Bible tucked under his arm. Nothing about him suggested danger. The townspeople barely looked up from their morning routines. Arlo Morrow moved with quiet purpose. His weathered hands held reins steady, but his sharp eyes cataloged every detail. The corrupt sheriff's office, the too-clean bank building, the nervous glances between certain citizens. He tied his horse outside Murphy's general store and stepped inside. The elderly shopkeeper looked up from his ledger. "Morning, stranger. Passing through?" "Traveling preacher," Arlo said softly. "Heard this town might need some guidance." Murphy's expression darkened. "We got troubles, that's for sure. But I don't think preaching's gonna help much. Sometimes faith moves mountains. Sometimes it just moves the right people." Arlo purchased basic supplies and asked careful questions. Which families needed help? Who held real power in town? Where did people gather to discuss their problems? Murphy warmed to the subject. He spoke of corrupt officials, of families losing their land to mysterious legal troubles. He mentioned the black woman living alone on the outskirts, how certain folks had been eyeing her property. "Name's Lavinia Morrow," Murphy said. "Keeps to herself mostly. Strange thing is, ain't nobody seen her husband in years. Some say he's dead. Others think he ran off." Arlo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What do you think?" "I think a woman like that deserves better than what this town's been giving her." Outside, Arlo walked the streets with measured steps. He noted which buildings housed the real power. Bank President Edmund Harcourt's mansion overlooked the town like a fortress. Sheriff Clay's office sat conveniently close to the saloon where questionable deals were made. Near the edge of town, he found Elias Vickers slumped against a fence post. The man reeked of whiskey, but his eyes held intelligence buried under years of disappointment. "You seen anything unusual today?" Arlo asked. Elias squinted up at him. "Unusual? Mister, everything in this town's unusual. Just this morning I saw good men acting like bandits." "Where?" Out at the Morrow place. Bunch of fellows camping on her land like they own it. Elias struggled to his feet. Should have done something. Should have helped her. Why didn't you? Because I'm a coward. Because standing up to them means standing up to the sheriff, the bank, half the town council. Elias wiped his mouth with a shaking hand. Because good people like her always lose in places like this. Arlo studied the broken man before him. Behind the alcohol and self-pity lived someone who still recognized right from wrong. That was more than could be said for most of Redemption Creek's leadership. Maybe it's time that changed, Arlo said. He left Elias and rode toward the Morrow property. From a ridge overlooking the ranch, he counted 8 men now. They'd made themselves at home, posting guards and organizing shifts. This wasn't random theft anymore. Through a spyglass, he watched them examining maps and equipment. Their excitement was obvious. They thought they'd found treasure, but Arlo knew better. Those maps represented something far more valuable than gold. As afternoon faded to evening, he made his decision. Sheriff Clay was drinking alone when Arlo entered the saloon. The lawman looked up with the bleary confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. "New in town?" Clay asked. "Passing through. Couldn't help but notice some commotion out at the Morrow place." Clay's expression hardened. "That ain't none of your concern, preacher." Arlo sat down across from him. "Actually, it is." He reached into his coat and placed a brass badge on the table. "Federal Marshal Arlo Morrow, I believe you have my wife." The color drained from Clay's face. Around the saloon, conversation stopped. Men who'd been laughing suddenly found their drinks very interesting. "You're supposed to be dead," Clay whispered. "Disappointing, I know." Arlo's voice remained calm, but his presence filled the room like gathering storm clouds. "I've been investigating land fraud throughout the territory. Imagine my surprise when the trail led to my own wife's property." Clay reached for his gun. Arlo's hand moved faster, pinning the sheriff's wrist to the table. No violence, just superior reflexes and years of experience. "I wouldn't. You're already in enough trouble. You got no authority here. I have federal authority everywhere." Arlo released Clay's wrist and produced official documents. "I've been documenting systematic theft of legitimate land claims. Your name appears frequently in my reports." Other men in the saloon began edging toward the door. Arlo's reputation might have been mysterious, but federal marshals were real and dangerous in ways that mattered to criminals. "What do you want?" Clay asked. "Justice, the legal kind." Arlo stood up. "You have until tomorrow morning to release my wife and arrest the men who took her. After that, territorial authorities take over. And if I refuse, then you'll discover why desperate men tell stories about me around campfires." Arlo walked out, leaving Clay alone with his fear. Behind him, the saloon buzzed with nervous whispers. Word would spread quickly now. The mysterious husband wasn't dead. He wasn't a legend. He was something far more dangerous to corrupt men than any gunfighter could ever be. He was the law. Dawn brought panic to the men guarding Lavinia's barn. Word had spread through town like wildfire. The mysterious husband was alive, federal, and furious. Cornelius paced outside the locked doors, his earlier confidence crumbling with each passing hour. Inside the barn, Lavinia worked methodically. Her captors had made a critical error. They'd imprisoned her in the place she knew better than anywhere else. Every board, every hidden space, every carefully planned detail served her now. She pressed against a section of the back wall. The panel slid aside, revealing a narrow passage she'd constructed during the barn's building. Her maps weren't just pretty pictures. They were escape routes, supply caches, and strategic advantages carved into the very landscape. Cornelius burst through the front doors, with 3 men behind him. "Time for answers, woman. My boss wants to know everything about these mineral deposits." "Your boss?" Lavinia emerged from the shadows, no longer bound. "You mean Edmund Harcourt?" The men spun around, shocked to find her free. Cornelius drew his pistol, but Lavinia didn't flinch. "How did you know about Harcourt?" "The same way I know about the forged land deeds, the fraudulent mining claims, the systematic theft of legitimate homesteads." Lavinia stepped closer. Did you really think a cartographer wouldn't recognize property fraud when she saw it? One of the younger men looked confused. Cartographer? Lavinia pulled out her official documents, the ones they'd been too greedy to examine properly. United States Geological Survey. I've been mapping this territory for 3 years, documenting every legitimate claim, every boundary dispute, every illegal seizure. The papers passed from hand to hand, government seals, official signatures, detailed reports about mineral rights and land ownership that had nothing to do with treasure hunting. You're not looking for gold, Cornelius said slowly. You're looking for evidence. I already found it. Your operation, Harcourt's Bank, Sheriff Clay's selective law enforcement. It's all documented and filed with territorial authorities. The youngest man dropped his weapon. We ain't criminals, miss. We're just trying to feed our families. By stealing from other families trying to do the same thing. Lavinia's voice carried surprising gentleness. Look at those maps again. Really look. She pointed to specific markings they'd ignored in their gold fever. Property lines drawn in red ink. Dates of illegal foreclosures. Names of families forced off their land by manufactured debts and false claims. Harcourt's been stealing legitimate homesteads and selling them to desperate settlers like you. Then he forecloses on you too, creating an endless cycle of theft and desperation. Outside, horses approached at full gallop. Cornelius ran to the window and cursed under his breath. It's the marshal. Arlo arrived alone, but his presence filled the ranch yard like an occupying army. He dismounted slowly, every movement calculated to project authority rather than aggression. Cornelius Thorne, he called out. Federal warrant for your arrest on charges of land fraud and conspiracy. You got no proof. My wife has 3 years' worth of proof. Every forged deed, every illegal foreclosure, every corrupt transaction. Arlo stepped closer to the barn. More importantly, I have testimony from victims across 5 counties. Through the barn walls, Lavinia heard familiar authority in her husband's voice. Not the legendary gunfighter from campfire stories, but something more dangerous to criminals. A man who built cases with evidence and patience. She remembered their first meeting 5 years ago in Denver. She'd been documenting mining claim disputes for the territorial government. He'd been investigating corruption in federal land offices. 2 professionals who discovered they shared more than just a mission. Their partnership had grown from mutual respect to deep love, bound together by shared dedication to justice. When her assignment brought her to Wyoming, his investigation had followed the same trail of corruption. Lavinia, Arlo called. You unharmed in there? Present and accounted for, Marshal Morrow. Even through her fear, she smiled at the old joke. Professional partners who happened to be married, working the same case from different angles. Cornelius's men were wavering. The youngest had already holstered his weapon. Another was reading Lavinia's documents with growing understanding of how badly they'd been manipulated. We've been played, he said to Cornelius. Harcourt told us these were claim jumpers taking our rightful land. But look at these dates. These folks were here first. Harcourt lied to all of us, Lavinia said. The families you thought were stealing from you were the original legitimate owners. He's been playing both sides, creating conflicts to cover his own theft. A commotion outside drew everyone's attention. More riders approached, but these wore the badges of territorial marshals. Arlo hadn't come alone after all. He'd simply positioned his backup beyond immediate sight. Cornelius, Arlo's voice carried new urgency. My colleagues are here with arrest warrants for Harcourt Clay and 6 town council members. This is your last chance to cooperate rather than face federal conspiracy charges. Through the barn window, Lavinia saw Elias Vickers riding with the marshals. The former drunk sat straighter in his saddle, wearing a deputy's badge that caught the morning sunlight. The net was closing on Redemption Creek's corruption. But the real test would come, when powerful men realized their comfortable world of illegal profits was about to collapse around them. The sound of approaching horses shattered the morning calm. Sheriff Clay rode hard toward the Morrow Ranch, leading a posse of 8 men. Dust clouds marked their desperate charge across the valley floor. Arlo stepped away from the barn, positioning himself between the approaching riders and his wife. His hand rested calmly on his holster, but his eyes calculated angles and cover positions with professional precision. "That's far enough, Clay," he called out. The corrupt sheriff pulled up 20 yards away, his posse spreading wide in a practiced formation. These weren't random townspeople. They moved like experienced gunmen. "Arlo Morrow, you're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer and trespassing on private property." Arlo pulled out his marshal's badge, holding it high enough for all to see. "My credentials are legitimate. Are yours?" Clay's face flushed red. "I'm the duly appointed sheriff of this county, appointed by men who are about to face federal charges." Arlo gestured toward the territorial marshals positioned on the surrounding ridges. "My colleagues have warrants for your entire organization." Inside the barn, Lavinia heard everything through the thin walls. She knew Arlo well enough to recognize his strategy. He was buying time, forcing the corrupt officials to reveal themselves publicly rather than operating in shadows. Cornelius and his remaining men watched nervously from the barn doorway. The youngest had already surrendered, but 3 others still wavered between cooperation and desperation. "This is bigger than we thought," one whispered. "If they got federal marshals involved." "Shut up," Cornelius hissed. "We stick to the plan." But Lavinia could see their resolve cracking. These weren't hardened criminals. They were desperate men who'd been manipulated by more sophisticated corruption than they understood. Outside, Clay's posse grew restless. Their horses stamped and snorted, sensing the tension building between opposing forces. "Stand down, Marshal," Clay called. "You got no jurisdiction here." "Federal marshals have jurisdiction everywhere in United States territory." Arlo's voice carried across the yard with calm authority, especially when investigating organized land fraud affecting multiple counties. A new rider appeared on the eastern ridge. Edmund Harcourt himself, the bank president who'd orchestrated years of systematic theft. He sat his expensive horse like a man surveying his private kingdom. "Enough of this nonsense," Harcourt shouted. "Sheriff Clay, arrest that man and everyone with him!" The mask was finally off, the supposedly respectable banker revealing himself as the true power behind Redemption Creek's corruption. Lavinia seized the moment. She slipped out through her hidden passage and emerged behind the barn, invisible to Clay's posse but clearly visible to Arlo and the territorial marshals. She carried her surveying equipment and a satchel of documents, evidence that would end careers and send powerful men to federal prison. "Gentlemen," she called out, her clear voice cutting through the standoff, "before anyone does anything foolish, you might want to see what's in these files." Clay spun his horse around, surprised to find her free and mobile. "Get back in that barn, woman." "My name is Lavinia Morrow, official cartographer for the United States Geological Survey." She held up her credentials for everyone to see. "I have documented evidence of systematic land fraud stretching back 5 years. One of Clay's posse members, a farmer named Jenkins, looked confused. "Land fraud? What's she talking about?" "Show them the Henderson file," Arlo called to his wife. Lavinia pulled out a thick folder. "The Henderson family, homesteaded legally in 1884. Harcourt foreclosed on manufactured debts in 1886, sold their land to new settlers for twice its value." Jenkins paled. "The Henderson place? That's my property now." "Which Harcourt will foreclose on next year using the same manufactured debts," Lavinia continued. "Then sell it to someone else. The cycle continues until he owns everything." More of Clay's men began looking uncomfortable. They'd believed they were protecting their legitimate interests. Now they realized they were protecting the system designed to destroy them. Harcourt spurred his horse forward. "Don't listen to her lies. These people are trying to steal what's rightfully ours." "Whose is it rightfully?" Lavinia spread out a large map showing the entire county. Every red mark represents a family driven off their legal homestead. Every blue mark shows the same land resold to new victims. The pattern was undeniable. Systematic theft disguised as legitimate business. Elias Vickers rode up from the south, leading a group of displaced families, men and women who'd lost everything to Harcourt's schemes. Their presence transformed the standoff into something larger. "There's the Henderson family," Lavinia pointed, "and the Kowalskis, the Carters. all driven off land they legally owned. Jenkins dismounted and walked over to speak with the Hendersons. Their quiet conversation ended with him removing his gun belt and stepping away from Clay's posse. 2 more of Clay's men followed suit. The corrupt sheriff found himself commanding a rapidly shrinking force. "This ends now, Harcourt," Arlo said. "Surrender peacefully and face federal court. Continue this charade and face additional charges of armed conspiracy." Harcourt's reply was to draw his pistol, but his shot went wide, panicked, and poorly aimed. Arlo didn't return fire. Instead, he dove for cover and let the territorial marshals handle the response. The brief gunfight ended quickly. Professional lawmen against desperate amateurs produced predictable results. No one died, but Harcourt found himself on the ground with a wounded shoulder and federal shackles around his wrists. Clay threw down his weapon in surrender. The corruption that had poisoned Redemption Creek for years crumbled in minutes once exposed to honest sunlight. The town square filled with people as word spread about the arrests. Families who'd lost their land emerged from hiding places across the territory. Workers who'd been cheated out of wages gathered around Lavinia's maps, spread across makeshift tables. Federal Marshal Thompson, Arlo's superior, read the charges aloud from the courthouse steps. Edmund Harcourt, conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Marcus Clay, abuse of authority and conspiracy. Town council members Franklin, Morrison, and Webb, accepting bribes and falsifying official documents. Each name drew murmurs from the crowd. People who'd seemed untouchable just hours before now sat in federal custody, their empire of corruption exposed for all to see. Lavinia stood beside her survey equipment, answering questions from displaced families. Her maps told stories of systematic theft that many had suspected, but none had been able to prove. "Mrs. Henderson," she said gently to an elderly woman, "your original homestead papers are valid. The foreclosure was based on fabricated debts." Sarah Henderson wept quietly. 5 years we've been living in that shack down by the river. 5 years thinking we failed. You didn't fail. You were robbed. Lavinia pulled out official documents. "The federal government will restore your land and compensate you for lost income." Similar conversations happened throughout the square. The Kowalski family learned their mining claim was legitimate despite years of harassment. The Carter Ranch, sold 3 times by Harcourt's bank, would return to its rightful owners. Jenkins approached hesitantly, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Morrow, what happens to folks like me? I bought that land in good faith." "The government will relocate you to unclaimed territory of equal value," Lavinia assured him. "You're a victim too, not a criminal." Arlo worked with the territorial marshals, coordinating the arrest process. Years of investigation were finally bearing fruit, but the complexity of undoing so much fraud would take months. "How many families affected?" Marshal Thompson asked. 47 confirmed cases across 5 counties, Arlo replied. Property value approaching $200,000. The scope staggered even experienced federal lawmen. Harcourt's operation had been more extensive than anyone realized. Elias Vickers pinned on his new sheriff's badge with shaking hands. The town council's emergency session had unanimously appointed him as interim law enforcement. His transformation from drunk to deputy to sheriff had taken less than a week. "Never thought I'd wear a badge," he admitted to Lavinia. "You earned it. Standing up to corruption takes more courage than most people have. Your husband could have shot his way through this. Why didn't he?" Lavinia smiled. "Because bullets don't restore stolen land. Evidence does. Justice does. Arlo learned long ago that the right legal victory is worth a dozen gunfights." The crowd parted as a new group arrived. Newspaper reporters from Cheyenne and Denver, drawn by word of the massive fraud bust. Their questions flew fast and urgent. "Mrs. Morrow, how long have you been investigating?" 3 years of official survey work, but the pattern became clear 18 months ago. "Marshal Morrow, is this connected to other corruption cases?" Arlo nodded gravely. "We believe this network extends into Colorado and Montana territories. This arrest breaks open a much larger investigation." The reporters scribbled furiously. By tomorrow, news of Redemption Creek's cleanup would spread across the frontier, serving warning to other corrupt officials. As afternoon faded to evening, the practical work began. Land deeds needed restoration. False debt records required nullification. Legitimate claims demanded federal protection. Lavinia worked tirelessly with displaced families, using her surveying skills to reestablish proper boundaries. Her maps became the foundation for rebuilding an honest community. Murphy, the general store owner, found her as she packed up her equipment. Town's gonna look different now. Better, I hope. Much better. But what happens to folks who got nobody to speak for them? Folks like you who don't fit what certain people think belongs here? Lavinia considered his question carefully. Justice doesn't have a color, Mr. Murphy. It just has truth. Today proved that truth is stronger than prejudice when good people choose to act. The evening brought a town meeting unlike any in Redemption Creek's history. The schoolhouse overflowed with residents, former residents, and newcomers alike. For the first time, everyone had an equal voice. Elias called the meeting to order, his voice steady despite his nervousness. First order of business is establishing fair property taxes based on actual land values, not manufactured debts. Voices rose in agreement. People who'd been afraid to speak publicly for years suddenly found their courage. Second item, all mining claims will be reevaluated using Mrs. Morrow's legitimate surveys, not fabricated maps designed to create conflicts. More approval from the crowd. Arlo stood to address the assembly. Federal oversight will continue until local government proves itself trustworthy. That means transparency in all transactions, public records, and fair treatment regardless of background. The meeting continued past midnight, rebuilding a community from honest foundations. Property lines were redrawn according to legal surveys. Fair wages were established for all workers. Equal protection under law became policy, not just principle. As the crowd dispersed, families began making plans to reclaim their stolen lives. The Henderson family would rebuild their ranch. The Kowalski mine would reopen under rightful ownership. Jenkins would receive good land in compensation, becoming a neighbor rather than an unwitting accomplice. Lavinia and Arlo walked home through quiet streets that felt different somehow. Clean, hopeful, ready for honest growth instead of parasitic corruption. Tomorrow would bring hard work rebuilding what had been destroyed. But tonight, justice had planted seeds that would grow into something better than what came before. 6 months later, Redemption Creek buzzed with honest prosperity. The main street hosted 3 new businesses, 2 expanded farms, and a legitimate mining operation that employed a dozen families. Children played safely in streets no longer ruled by fear and corruption. Lavinia's cartography office occupied the building that once housed Harcourt's fraudulent bank. Her hand-painted sign read, "Morrow Geographic Services," in bold letters visible from across the square. Inside, detailed maps covered every wall, documenting the territory's true wealth and boundaries. 2 apprentices worked at drafting tables, learning surveying techniques from someone who'd helped reshape an entire county. Mary Henderson, daughter of the displaced farming family, showed remarkable aptitude for precision drawing. Thomas Kowalski possessed an engineer's mind for calculating distances and elevations. "The Eastern Ridge Survey is complete," Mary reported, spreading out her careful measurements. 3 potential mine sites, all properly documented for legal claims. Lavinia examined the work with professional pride. Her students had absorbed not just technical skills, but ethical principles. Every map they created would serve justice rather than exploitation. Excellent work. File the original with the territorial office and prepare copies for the claimants. Through her window, Lavinia watched the weekly wagon train arrive from Denver. New settlers seeking honest opportunities in a place that had gained a reputation for fair dealing. Word had spread across the frontier about a town where hard work was rewarded and corruption found no foothold. Sheriff Elias Vickers met each wagon personally, ensuring newcomers understood Redemption Creek's transformation. His 6 months of sobriety had revealed sharp intelligence beneath years of alcohol-induced fog. The town council valued his insights on maintaining law without oppression. "Mrs. Morrow," called a voice from her doorway. James Murphy's son stood there with surveying equipment over his shoulder. "The new families want to know about land availability south of the river. Tell them to see me tomorrow morning. We'll ride out and examine the area properly." Lavinia appreciated how naturally the community had accepted her authority. Competence spoke louder than prejudice when people needed real expertise. The afternoon brought Arlo's return from his monthly circuit. As territorial marshal, he covered 5 counties, ensuring the corruption cleanup extended beyond Redemption Creek's borders. His reputation had evolved from mysterious gunfighter to methodical lawman who built cases with evidence rather than bullets. "How did the Morrison trial go?" Lavinia asked as he hung up his marshal's coat. "Guilty on all counts. Federal judge sentenced him to 5 years in territorial prison." Arlo settled into his chair with visible satisfaction. 3 more counties are requesting federal oversight based on evidence patterns similar to what we found here. Their work was expanding, justice spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. That evening's town meeting drew the largest crowd yet. The schoolhouse had been expanded twice to accommodate growing participation in local government. Every voice mattered now. Every concern received serious consideration. "First item," Sheriff Vickers announced, "is the silver discovery north of Murphy's Ridge." Excited murmurs filled the room. Lavinia's recent survey had confirmed significant mineral deposits on unclaimed federal land. The question was how to develop the resource fairly. "Mrs. Morrow has prepared options for community consideration," Vickers continued. Lavinia stood and unfurled her detailed proposal. Option 1. Sell claims to the highest bidders, creating wealth for a few. Option 2. Establish cooperative mining with profits shared equally among all families. The room erupted in discussion. Voices raised but remained respectful, people working through complex issues together rather than having decisions imposed by corrupt officials. Old Murphy raised his hand. "What about folks who don't want to mine? Farmers and shopkeepers?" The cooperative would pay dividends to all residents based on length of residence and community contribution, Lavinia explained. "Everyone benefits from our shared resource." More discussion followed. Questions about environmental protection, worker safety, sustainable development. These weren't the desperate conversations of oppressed people, but the thoughtful planning of a community in control of its own destiny. After 2 hours of debate, they reached consensus: cooperative mining with environmental safeguards, profit sharing, and democratic oversight, a model that other communities were already requesting to study and replicate. As the meeting dispersed, families made plans that extended years into the future. The Henderson Ranch would expand into cattle breeding. The Kowalski family would develop mining equipment manufacturing. Jenkins had proven himself an excellent wheat farmer on his new land. Lavinia and Arlo walked home through streets lit by prosperity rather than desperation. Children ran past them playing games instead of hiding from corrupt officials. Shop windows displayed goods earned through honest labor rather than stolen through manipulation. "Remember what this place was like 6 months ago?" Arlo asked. "I remember what it felt like to be afraid in my own home." "And now?" Lavinia considered the question as they reached their rebuilt ranch. Her barn had become a symbol of transformation. Housing, surveying equipment that created opportunity rather than fear. Her maps hung on walls as proof that truth could reshape landscapes, both physical and social. "Now I see what happens when good people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable." Above them, stars emerged in the Wyoming sky, the same stars that had witnessed corruption and now observed redemption. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new settlers, new opportunities to prove that honest communities could thrive on the frontier. The story that began with settlers breaking into a woman's barn had become something larger. A testament that intelligence and integrity could triumph over greed and prejudice. That justice, properly applied, created foundations strong enough to support everyone's dreams. In Redemption Creek, the future belonged to those brave enough to build it honestly.